You're here with Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if you haven't already, I'd love it if you'd subscribe. There's something about knowing you're out there listening that makes this feel less like talking into the void. Which country are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? I ask because this story works best in the quiet hours, when your mind can settle into something real. Tonight, we're not chasing shadows or whispers. We're following a trail of actual documents, cataloging systems, and administrative decisions that shaped what historians could and couldn't know for centuries. This isn't about mystery for mystery's sake. It's about understanding how silence gets built, rule by rule, shelf by shelf. And once you start understanding how that works, there's no going back to just wondering. You're standing in a room that doesn't officially exist on any public tour map of the Vatican, and the first thing you notice isn't the darkness or the age of the stone, it's the smell. Old paper, leather bindings that have absorbed centuries of Roman humidity, and something else, something metallic and faint that you'll later realize is the scent of iron clasps that have oxidized slowly over 400 years. This is one of the lower archive rooms beneath the Vatican Library, accessible only through a corridor that branches off from the main Sistine Hall storage area. And it was here, in 1798, that a French cataloguer named Antoine Duchamp recorded in his personal diary, not in any official Vatican record, that he had encountered a bound manuscript so tall that reading it required standing at a specially constructed lectern, and that the manuscript itself was chained not to prevent theft, but to prevent it from being laid flat, because lying it flat would damage the binding. Duchamp was part of Napoleon's occupying force, brought in to inventory what the French administration considered assets of historical importance, and though his work was later dismissed by Vatican archivists as the confused observations of a non-specialist, his diary survived in the French National Archives, and in it he describes a classification system he didn't understand, documents marked with a small red cross in the upper right corner of the first page, which he assumed meant they were of religious significance, but which actually indicated they were part of the Secretum Archivum, the secret archive, a designation that didn't mean occult or forbidden in the way modern audiences imagine, but rather that these were documents considered private to the papal administration, not for public consultation. The Secretum Archivum wasn't officially open to researchers until 1881 under Pope Leo XIII, and even then access was granted only to scholars who could demonstrate both academic credentials and a project that wouldn't, in the Vatican's judgment, bring scandal or misunderstanding to the Church's historical record. This wasn't censorship in the crude sense of burning books or erasing history. It was something more methodical, more institutional, and in many ways more effective because it didn't erase anything. It simply controlled who could form an interpretation and when and under what circumstances. The physical reality of this control was the consultation system itself, which required a researcher to submit a written request specifying exactly which documents they wished to see, identified by catalog number and date range, which meant you had to already know what you were looking for before you could look for it. A circular logic that kept entire categories of documents effectively invisible, not because they were hidden, but because no one knew to ask for them. The manuscript Duchamp described was later identified, though not with certainty, as a 1633 compilation of Inquisition trial records from the Spanish territories, bound in a single volume that measured nearly 4 feet tall when opened. And the reason it was bound this way wasn't grandiosity or ceremony, it was purely practical. The documents were papal briefs, official letters, and sworn testimonies that had been sent to Rome on large sheets of parchment, and cutting them down would have invalidated their legal status as authentic records. So, they were bound as they arrived, which created a physical object that was nearly impossible to read in the normal way, and the Vatican's solution wasn't to rebind the documents, which would have required papal authorization and a formal acknowledgement that the original binding method had been flawed, but simply to install a standing lectern in the consultation room and add a note to the catalog that the volume required special handling. This is how institutions preserve their authority, not by admitting mistakes, but by incorporating the consequences of those mistakes into the system itself, until the workaround becomes the procedure and the procedure becomes tradition. Duchamp noted in his diary that he spent less than an hour with the manuscript because standing to read was exhausting, and because the French administration wasn't particularly interested in Inquisition records from territories that were no longer under church control, and so the volume was reshelved, and Duchamp moved on to inventory other materials, and the manuscript remained in its standing access-only state for another century. But here's what makes this story more than just an anecdote about an awkward book. The standing lectern rule wasn't unique to this one manuscript. It was applied to at least 14 other volumes in the same archive section, all of them oversized compilations from the 16th and 17th centuries, all of them dealing with Inquisition proceedings, ecclesiastical court rulings, or diplomatic correspondence that involved sensitive negotiations with Protestant states. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this pattern was intentional, whether someone in the Vatican's archival administration deliberately chose binding methods that would make these documents harder to consult, or whether it was simply an accident of bureaucratic inertia, a case of no one wanting to take responsibility for authorizing a costly rebinding project. But the effect was the same either way. These documents were technically available, which meant the Vatican could claim transparency, but they were practically difficult to access, which meant most researchers either skipped them or gave them only cursory attention, and the information they contained remained, for all practical purposes, outside the main flow of historical scholarship until well into the 20th century. The Vatican Mysteries weren't always about locked doors and forbidden chambers. Sometimes they were about filing systems and furniture. The cataloging reform of 1912, initiated under Pope Pius X, is usually remembered by church historians as a modernization effort, an attempt to bring the Vatican's archival practices in line with the methods being developed at state archives across Europe. But what's less often discussed is that the reform also introduced a new classification category called Riserva, which translates to reserve, and documents placed in this category were marked with a small blue stamp rather than the old red cross, and the blue stamp indicated that the document could be consulted only with written permission from the prefect of the secret archives, not just the general archivist, which added an additional layer of bureaucratic control that effectively meant no foreign scholar, and very few Italian scholars, could access these materials without a formal letter of introduction from a cardinal or a senior Vatican official. The Riserva category was applied retroactively to thousands of documents, including many that had previously been part of the General Secretum collection, and the justification given in the internal Vatican memo that announced the change, a memo that wasn't published but was later discovered by an archivist named Margherita Guarducci in the 1960s, tucked into a folder of administrative correspondence, was that certain documents contained information that might be subject to misinterpretation by scholars unfamiliar with the theological and political context of the period, which is Vatican diplomatic language for saying that the Church didn't trust outsiders to read these materials without drawing conclusions that would be embarrassing or damaging to the institution. The physical implementation of this new system was simple but effective. Documents marked Riserva were moved from the main archive halls, which were arranged by subject and date, to a separate storage area in the Torre dei Venti, the Tower of the Winds, a 16th century astronomical observatory that had been partially converted to archive storage in the 19th century. The Tower of the Winds isn't a dramatic Gothic dungeon. It's a Renaissance structure with frescoed ceilings and large windows that were originally used to observe the sun's position for calendar reform. But by the early 20th century, it had become a kind of auxiliary storage space for materials that didn't fit neatly into the main cataloging system, and the Riserva documents were shelved there in wooden cabinets that were locked with keys held only by the prefect and his deputy. This wasn't about protecting the documents from theft or damage. Vatican archivists took pride in their preservation methods, and there's no evidence that these materials were at any greater risk than anything else in the collection. It was about controlling interpretation, about ensuring that if anyone was going to write about these subjects, they would have to go through channels that gave the Vatican an opportunity to know who was asking, what they were planning to write, and whether their work could be influenced or shaped before publication. This is what institutional memory looks like in practice. Not a conspiracy of silence, but a bureaucratic architecture that makes certain kinds of questions harder to ask and certain kinds of answers harder to find. The reform of 1912 also introduced a new cataloging standard that required each document to be described not just by date and subject, but by sensitivity classification, a ranking system from 1 to 5, with 5 being the most sensitive, and documents ranked 4 or 5 were automatically placed in reserva regardless of their age or content. The criteria for sensitivity classification were never made public. They were laid out in an internal manual that circulated only among senior archivists, but from the patterns that emerged in later years, scholars have been able to infer at least some of the rules. Documents that mentioned internal church conflicts, especially disputes between popes and bishops or between Rome and regional church authorities, tended to receive higher sensitivity rankings, as did anything involving financial arrangements between the Vatican and secular governments, anything related to the Inquisition's methods rather than just its verdicts, and anything that documented the Church's response to Protestant criticism or Reformation-era controversies. One widely accepted historical fact about this period is that the Vatican was deeply concerned about modernist theological movements within the Church, scholars and priests who were trying to reconcile Catholic doctrine with contemporary historical and scientific methods, and Pope Pius X issued a papal encyclical in 1907 called Pascendi Dominici Gregis that condemned modernism as a heresy and required all clergy to take an oath against it. The archival reform of 1912 happened in this context, and while there's no direct evidence that the two were coordinated, the timing suggests that the Vatican was thinking systematically about how to control not just theological ideas in the present, but also how the Church's past would be studied and interpreted by future generations. The consequence of this reform was that by the 1920s, when the first generation of professional historians who weren't clergy began to request access to Vatican materials, they found themselves navigating a system that was nominally open but practically obstructed at every turn. You could submit a request to see documents about, say, the Church's diplomatic correspondence during the 30 Years' War, but when your request came back, half the documents you'd asked for would be marked Reserva, and you'd be told you needed additional authorization, and by the time you got that authorization, months would have passed, and sometimes the permission would be granted but with conditions, such as that you couldn't quote directly from the documents without Vatican approval of the specific passages, or that you had to submit your manuscript to a church historian for review before publication. These weren't universal rules. They were applied inconsistently, which made them even more effective as a control mechanism because researchers never knew quite where the line was, and so they tended to self-censor, avoiding topics or questions that might trigger additional scrutiny. This is how silence gets built into the historical record. Not by erasing evidence, but by making it exhausting to access, by creating a system where the path of least resistance is to work on something else, to ask different questions, to leave certain stories untold because telling them requires more time, more persistence, and more institutional tolerance than most scholars have. The standing lectern that Duchamp described in 1798 was still in use as late as 1954, according to an American researcher named Robert Graham, a Jesuit priest and historian who spent 12 years working in the Vatican archives and who published his observations in a memoir that most scholars consider dry and technical, but which contains scattered details that reveal far more about the practical reality of archival work than any official Vatican publication. Graham mentions the lectern almost in passing in a footnote about the physical challenges of working with oversized materials, and he notes that by the 1950s the lectern had been moved to a different room, a consultation chamber on the second floor of the main archive building, and that it was used for several categories of documents beyond just the Inquisition volumes: diplomatic correspondence with Russia from the 18th century, bound collections of papal bulls issued during the Council of Trent, and a set of financial records from the Papal States that documented taxation and revenue collection in territories that no longer existed. The common thread wasn't size. Although all these documents were physically large, it was that they were all materials that could be used to argue that the Church had exercised secular political power in ways that contradicted its spiritual mission, that it had taxed populations harshly, negotiated cynically with hostile powers, or enforced orthodoxy through methods that wouldn't stand up to modern ethical scrutiny. Graham doesn't say this directly. His memoir is carefully neutral in tone, as you'd expect from a Jesuit writing about the institution that employed him. But the implication is there in the way he describes the consultation process, the way certain documents required not just written permission but a meeting with the archivist to explain your research purpose, and the way that meeting often ended with the archivist suggesting alternative sources that might be more representative or better documented. The Vatican archives weren't and aren't a monolithic censorship machine. There were and are individual archivists who were deeply committed to historical transparency, who went out of their way to help researchers find materials even when those materials were inconvenient for the Church's official narrative. But the system itself, the structure of permissions and classifications and access rules, created an environment where caution and discretion were rewarded, and persistence was often punished with delays and bureaucratic obstacles. The standing lectern system was finally abolished in 1975, not because of any dramatic reform or pressure from historians, but because the Vatican began a major preservation project that involved rehousing documents in acid-free folders and climate-controlled storage. And as part of that project, several of the oversized volumes were disbound, and the individual pages were mounted on archival board, which made them much easier to handle and photograph. This decision was made by a preservation committee, not by the historical administration, and it seems to have been driven by practical concerns about paper degradation rather than any ideological shift toward greater access. But the effect was that materials that had been practically difficult to consult for centuries suddenly became much easier to work with. And in the decade after 1975, there was a noticeable increase in scholarly publications dealing with Inquisition procedures, papal diplomacy with Protestant states, and the Church's role in early modern taxation and governance. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this increase was directly caused by the rehousing project or whether it was part of a broader trend in historical scholarship that was moving toward more critical examinations of institutional power. But the timing is suggestive, and several researchers who worked in the Vatican archives in the late 70s and early 80s have commented in interviews and memoirs that the atmosphere felt different, that there was less of a sense that you were being watched, or that your work was being judged for its loyalty to church interests. The secrets beneath the Vatican weren't always dramatic revelations or shocking cover-ups. Sometimes they were simply information that had been allowed to sit undisturbed because no one had the stamina to deal with the procedural barriers to accessing it. But here's the detail that brings this into sharper focus. When those oversized volumes were disbound in the 1970s, the preservation team found that several of the pages had notes written in the margins, not by the original authors of the documents, but by later archivists, dates ranging from the 17th century to the early 20th century, and these marginal notes were instructions about how the document should be classified or whether it should be shown to outside researchers. One note, on a page from a 1642 Inquisition trial record, reads in Latin, "Not for consultation without express permission," and it's dated 1789, which means that someone, more than a century after the trial, decided that this particular record needed special protection. The trial in question wasn't of anyone famous. It was a case against a village priest in Sicily who had been accused of teaching that salvation didn't require confession to a priest, a relatively minor theological dispute. But apparently someone in the late 18th century thought that even this small challenge to church authority shouldn't be freely available to researchers. Another marginal note on a page from a 1695 diplomatic letter to the Russian Orthodox Church reads, "Sensitivity high. Political implications," dated 1911, right before the cataloging reform that introduced the Reserva system. These notes weren't part of any official policy. They were ad hoc decisions by individual archivists, which suggests that the system of controlled access developed gradually, organically, as a series of small choices made by people who believed they were protecting the institution's reputation, and over time, those choices accumulated into a structure that shaped what historians could know and what would remain obscure. In 1980, the Vatican announced that the secret archives would be renamed the Apostolic Archives, dropping the word secret in favor of a term that emphasized the archives' connection to the papal office rather than their restricted nature. And this was presented as a symbolic gesture of openness, a recognition that the old terminology carried connotations that no longer matched the institution's actual practices. But the announcement of the name change coincided with a less publicized revision to the access protocols, a revision that created a new category called Archival Section 12, which wasn't a physical location but a classification designation for documents that were considered to involve matters of ongoing institutional sensitivity. And documents in this category were to be stored in their normal locations, but flagged in the catalog system so that any request to consult them would trigger an automatic review process. Section 12 wasn't defined by time period or subject matter. It was defined by a checklist that archivists were supposed to apply when processing incoming materials or re-cataloging existing ones. And the checklist included criteria like involves financial transactions between the Holy See and secular governments, documents internal disciplinary proceedings against clergy, relates to the Church's position on matters currently subject to public debate, and, most broadly, might be used to support arguments contrary to Church teaching or practice. This last criterion was vague enough that it gave archivists enormous discretion, and in practice, it seems to have been applied inconsistently, with some archivists flagging large volumes of material and others using it sparingly. The practical consequence for researchers was that the Vatican archives of the 1980s and 90s became a two-tier system. Materials that weren't flagged as Section 12 could be consulted relatively easily, sometimes within a few weeks of submitting a request, while Section 12 materials often required months of back-and-forth correspondence, and even when permission was granted, it sometimes came with conditions about how the material could be cited, or whether the researcher had to sign an agreement not to publish certain categories of information without Vatican approval. One obscure but telling detail from this period comes from a German historian named Klaus Schatz, who was researching the Vatican's diplomatic relations with Bismarck's Germany in the 1870s, and he requested access to correspondence between Pope Pius IX and the German bishops during the Kulturkampf, Bismarck's campaign to reduce Catholic influence in German public life. Schatz's request was approved, but when he arrived in Rome and began working with the documents, he discovered that several letters were missing from the sequence, and when he asked about them, he was told they had been temporarily relocated for preservation assessment. He followed up on this over the next several months, and eventually he was told that the letters had been reclassified as Section 12 and that he would need to submit a new request specifically for those documents, explaining how they related to his research and what he intended to publish. Schatz did this, and his request was approved, but by then he had already spent his research fellowship period in Rome and had returned to Germany, and by the time he could arrange another trip, more than 2 years had passed. He did eventually see the letters, and he published a book about the Kulturkampf that's considered authoritative, but in the introduction to that book he notes dryly that the research process involved navigating an archival system that appeared designed to reward patience rather than curiosity. This is the reality of how institutional control operates in practice, not through dramatic acts of suppression, but through friction, delay, and procedural complexity that wears down all but the most determined researchers. The Section 12 system remained in place until 2003, when Pope John Paul II authorized another major archival reform, this one aimed at making materials from the Second World War period available to historians. And as part of that reform, the Section 12 designation was officially retired and replaced with a simpler three-tier access system: open, restricted, and closed. Open materials could be consulted by any researcher with academic credentials. Restricted materials required written permission from the prefect but with no special conditions attached. And closed materials were genuinely off-limits, mostly consisting of documents less than 75 years old or materials that involved living individuals. This system was clearer and more predictable, and most historians who worked in the Vatican archives after 2003 report that the experience became noticeably less frustrating. But the reform didn't change the fact that decades of scholarship had already been shaped by the earlier restrictions, that whole research agendas had been abandoned or redirected because certain questions were too difficult to pursue, and that the historical narratives that had become established during that period were now hard to dislodge even when new evidence became available. Vatican Secrets, in this sense, weren't individual facts that had been suppressed. They were patterns of emphasis and omission that had been built into the scholarly literature by the cumulative effect of access restrictions over generations. The document that could only be read standing up, the one Duchamp described in 1798, was finally photographed in its entirety in 1992 as part of a digitization project funded by a consortium of European universities, and the photographs were made available to researchers through the Vatican Library's digital catalog, which meant that for the first time scholars could examine the document without traveling to Rome, without requesting permission, and without standing at a lectern for hours. The digitization process revealed something that hadn't been noted in any of the earlier catalog descriptions. The volume actually contained two distinct sets of documents that had been bound together at some point in the 18th century, probably during one of the periodic reorganizations of the archive. The first set was the Inquisition trial records from the Spanish territories that had always been understood to be the volume's main content. But the second set, inserted about two-thirds of the way through, was a collection of letters between the Roman Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition, dating from 1620 to 1640, and these letters weren't trial records. They were administrative correspondence about procedure, about how to handle specific categories of accused heretics, about what kinds of evidence were sufficient to proceed to torture, and about how to manage cases where the accused had confessed under duress and then recanted. These letters hadn't been cataloged separately because whoever bound the volume together had treated it as a single unit, and the catalog description from the 19th century simply said Inquisition materials, Spanish territories, 16th and 17th centuries, which was accurate but incomplete. The existence of this administrative correspondence had been known in general terms. Historians knew that the Roman and Spanish Inquisitions had coordinated their activities, but having the specific letters available allowed for a much more detailed understanding of how that coordination worked in practice. And several scholarly articles published in the late 1990s used this material to argue that the Inquisition's procedures were more systematized and more bureaucratically rationalized than had previously been understood, that there were written guidelines for inquisitors that specified how many sessions of questioning were required before torture could be authorized, what kinds of torture were permitted and under what circumstances, and how confessions obtained under torture were supposed to be verified. This was uncomfortable material for the Church because it contradicted the narrative that the Inquisition had been primarily a Spanish institution, driven by the particular religious politics of Spain, and that Rome's involvement had been limited and largely aimed at restraining Spanish excesses. The letters showed clearly that Rome had been deeply involved, that Roman officials had sometimes pushed for harsher measures than the Spanish wanted, and that the institutional Church had invested significant significant administrative resources in developing what amounted to a bureaucratic machinery of doctrinal enforcement. One widely accepted historical fact from this period is that the Roman Inquisition was formally established by Pope Paul III in 1542, originally to combat the spread of Protestant ideas in Italy, and that it continued to operate with varying levels of intensity until it was reorganized in the 19th century into what eventually became the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican office responsible for doctrinal orthodoxy. But what the newly available letters revealed was how much continuity there was in institutional methods, how procedures developed in the 16th century to deal with Protestant heresy were still being referenced in internal church documents in the 20th century when dealing with modernist theologians, not because the church was literally torturing people anymore, but because the bureaucratic logic of how to identify, isolate, and suppress theological deviation had remained remarkably consistent. Some historians quietly disagree about how much weight to give to this continuity, whether it represents a genuine institutional memory and culture that persists across centuries, or whether it's more a case of similar organizational problems generating similar organizational solutions independently in different eras. But either way, the letters provided concrete evidence that the Church's approach to managing internal dissent wasn't a series of isolated historical moments, but a long-term institutional strategy. The consequence of these letters becoming available was that it became much harder for church historians to maintain the position that the Inquisition had been an aberration or a product of medieval thinking that had no connection to modern church practice. And this created a certain amount of tension within Catholic academic circles, because there were scholars who wanted to engage honestly with this history and others who felt that dwelling on it provided ammunition for anti-Catholic critics and distracted from the Church's positive contributions to education, charity, and social justice. This tension played out in journal articles, conferences, and academic politics in ways that aren't visible in the published record, but that shaped which kinds of research projects got funded, which scholars got promoted, and which interpretations of church history became dominant in textbooks and general histories. The Vatican archives themselves, the physical institution, remained relatively neutral in these debates. By the 1990s, the archival staff were mostly professional historians and librarians who took their role as custodians of historical evidence seriously, and there's little evidence that they were actively trying to shape scholarship in one direction or another. But the archive exists within a larger institutional structure, and that structure has priorities and sensitivities that inevitably influence what gets preserved, how it gets cataloged, and what paths researchers are encouraged or discouraged from pursuing. The Tower of the Winds, where the Riserva documents were stored for most of the 20th century, was finally emptied and closed to archival use in 2008, not because of any scandal or controversy, but because the building's climate control systems were failing and the cost of upgrading them was deemed excessive given that newer, purpose-built archive facilities were available elsewhere in the Vatican complex. The documents were moved to the bunker, which is the informal name for the underground storage facility built beneath the Cortile della Pina, the courtyard of the Pine Cone, in the 1980s. And this facility was designed with modern archival standards in mind. Temperature and humidity controls, fire suppression systems, and reinforced shelving that could hold significantly more material per square meter than the old wooden cabinets in the tower. The move itself was a massive logistical undertaking that took nearly 2 years and involved cataloging each document again as it was relocated. And it was during this recataloguing process that several anomalies were discovered. Documents that had been marked Riserva, but that, when examined by contemporary archivists, didn't seem to contain anything particularly sensitive, at least not by early 21st century standards. One example was a set of financial records from the 1830s documenting the Vatican's investment in early railroad construction in the Papal States, which had been marked Riserva, apparently because someone in the 1920s had thought that evidence of the Church engaging in speculative commercial ventures might be embarrassing. But by 2008, this seemed like ordinary historical information, the kind of thing any large institution would have been doing in that era. These documents were reclassified as open and made available without restrictions. But the recataloguing also revealed other documents that remained sensitive or became more sensitive in light of later events. Correspondence from the 1930s and 40s related to the Vatican's knowledge of Nazi persecution of Jews, diplomatic communications with fascist Italy, and internal church discussions about how to respond to reports of clergy sexual abuse in various countries. These materials were kept as restricted or, in some cases, reclassified as closed, and the criteria for these decisions weren't made public, which led to renewed criticism from historians who argued that the Vatican was still, despite all the reforms and name changes and modernization efforts, operating on the principle that the institution's reputation took precedence over historical transparency. The Vatican's response to this criticism was usually that archival access had to be balanced against the privacy rights of individuals mentioned in the documents, against the need to protect ongoing diplomatic relationships, and against the risk that incomplete or decontextualized information might be misunderstood or misused, all of which are reasonable concerns that any archive housing sensitive materials would have to consider. But the application of these principles was opaque enough that it was impossible for outside observers to know whether they were being applied consistently or whether they were being used selectively to protect the Church from embarrassment. One obscure but revealing detail from this period comes from an Italian archivist named Gianni Venditti, who worked on the recataloguing project and who gave an interview to an academic journal in 2011 after he had retired, in which he described finding a folder marked "Do Not Catalog, Refer to Prefect" that contained photocopies of documents from the 1940s, and when he asked the prefect about it, he was told that the originals had been removed from the archive years earlier at the request of a senior Vatican official, and that the photocopies were kept as a record that the documents had once existed, but that they weren't to be included in the catalog or made available to researchers. Venditti didn't say what the documents were about, and he may not have been allowed to examine them closely enough to know, but the existence of this category, documents that were acknowledged to have existed but that had been deliberately removed from the accessible collection, suggests that even in the modern era, with all the reforms and transparency initiatives, there were still mechanisms by which information could be made to disappear. Not by destroying it entirely, but by moving it into a category that existed outside the normal archival system. Whether this happened frequently or rarely, whether it involved dozens of documents or thousands, whether it was done for legitimate reasons or to protect institutional interests, these are questions that can't be answered from outside the system, and that's precisely the point. The Vatican archives are ultimately controlled by the institution whose history they document, and while there are many individual archivists and officials within that institution who are committed to historical honesty, the structure itself creates incentives for caution, for protecting institutional reputation, for weighing the value of historical truth against the potential costs of revelation. This isn't unique to the Vatican. Government archives, corporate archives, even university archives face similar tensions, but the Vatican's archives are unique in the scope of their historical coverage, the religious and cultural significance of their contents, and the fact that the institution they document still exists and still wields considerable influence in the world. The consequence is that working with Vatican materials requires a certain kind of interpretive vigilance, an awareness that what you're seeing is what has been made available, and that what has been made available has been filtered through centuries of decisions about what matters, what's sensitive, and what story the institution wants told about itself. You've been listening for a while now, and maybe you're wondering whether any of this matters outside the specialized world of academic historians and Vatican scholars, whether the details of cataloging systems and access restrictions have any relevance to how you understand history or institutions or the way power operates in the world. And the answer is that it matters enormously, because this is how institutional memory works everywhere, not just in the Vatican, but in governments, corporations, universities, anywhere that records are kept and decisions are made about what to preserve and what to let fade. The Vatican is just an unusually well-documented example of a universal pattern, which is that institutions don't usually destroy evidence of their mistakes or controversial actions. They just make that evidence harder to find, harder to interpret, harder to use in ways that might challenge the institution's preferred narrative about itself. The standing lectern, the Reserva classification, the Section 12 system, the documents moved out of the catalog. These aren't separate stories. They're all part of a continuous institutional strategy of managing information, of controlling not what people know, but how easily they can know it, and how much work it takes to know it, and whether the work is worth the result. And the thing about this strategy is that it works, not perfectly, not forever, but well enough, for long enough that by the time information becomes freely available, the historical moment when it would have mattered most has often passed. The debates have moved on. The institutional reputation has been secured or damaged based on incomplete information, and the full story becomes a matter of academic interest rather than immediate concern. The documents that Antoine Duchamp saw in 1798, the ones that required standing to read, contained information about how the Inquisition operated in the 17th century, and that information wasn't suppressed or destroyed. It was just kept physically awkward to access for nearly 200 years, and by the time it became easy to access in the late 20th century, the Inquisition had been over for more than 100 years. The Church had moved through multiple crises and reforms, and the revelations about Inquisition procedures, while historically important, didn't have the immediate institutional impact they might have had if they'd been available a century earlier, when anti-clerical movements across Europe were arguing for the separation of church and state and using historical examples of church overreach to support their case. This is the long game of institutional memory. You don't have to suppress information forever, you just have to suppress it long enough that it becomes history rather than current events, context rather than crisis. And the Vatican has been playing this game longer than almost any other institution on earth, which makes its archives both an incredibly valuable resource for understanding how institutional power works and a deeply frustrating maze of access restrictions, classification systems, and procedural barriers that reflect centuries of accumulated caution. The reforms of recent decades have made the Vatican archives significantly more accessible than they were through most of the 20th century, and there are archivists and officials within the Vatican who genuinely believe in transparency and who work to make materials available even when those materials are uncomfortable for the Church. But the structural logic of the institution, the imperative to protect its authority and reputation, doesn't go away just because individual people within it have good intentions. And so, the archive remains what it has always been, a place where information is preserved but also managed, where history is documented but also shaped by decisions about what to show and when and to whom. You can work with these materials, you can learn from them, you can use them to build more accurate and complete accounts of the past, but you have to work with the awareness that you're working within a system that was designed intentionally or not to make certain kinds of questions easier to answer than others, to make certain narratives more accessible than alternatives, to reward researchers who accept the archive's own logic about what matters, and to exhaust those who push against it. And maybe that's the real secret, if there is one. Not that the Vatican is hiding specific scandalous facts, though there are undoubtedly still materials that would be embarrassing or damaging if they became public, but that the entire system is structured around the principle that the institution gets to decide what its own history looks like, what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, what becomes part of the historical record, and what remains a footnote or a rumor or a document that you can only read standing up. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. If you found something in this story that made you think differently about how institutions preserve their past, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video. It helps others find their way here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you will. New stories like this go up every day, and there's something reassuring about knowing you'll be there when the next one appears. Thank you for listening, wherever you are, whatever time it is. I'll be back tomorrow night.